Week 9. By the 9th week, the Atlantic no longer felt like a journey, it felt like confinement. The horizon had become a wall that never moved closer, no matter how many miles the ship cut through the water each day. The sails filled, the timbers creaked, and still the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, as if time itself had stalled somewhere between Ireland and America. Below deck, the air had grown heavier again. The earlier weeks had brought storms, sickness, grief, and fear, but now there was something worse settling over the emigrant hold. Familiarity. People had begun to recognize the sound of each other's breathing, the shape of each other's suffering, the exact rhythm of a cough that might or might not signal something worse. And now that familiarity was being broken, one person at a time. It began quietly. An old man from Limerick who had shared bread with Michael only days earlier stopped coming up for air. Then a young woman who had often helped Mary fetch water grew too weak to stand. Then a boy, not much older than Brandon, who had once laughed with Sean during a rare moment on deck, was carried away on a makeshift stretcher by two sailors. No announcements were made, none were necessary. The ship had become too small for secrets. Mary had stopped asking the surgeon questions, not because she trusted him less, but because she understood him more. Every answer now carried the same shape, uncertainty wrapped in politeness. Hope carefully limited to avoid collapse. The surgeon moved through the hold like a man walking through a memory that was slowly fading. He still checked pulses, still offered tinctures, still cleaned wounds where he could. But his silence said what his words could not. He was running out of ways to delay the inevitable. Brandon had begun waking in the night, not from nightmares exactly, but from listening. The sounds of sickness had become impossible to ignore. Coughing echoed constantly throughout the timbers. Sometimes it rose sharply and then stopped altogether. These silences were the ones that frightened him most. Sean no longer spoke about America. Instead, he asked questions that had no answers anyone wanted to give. Will we be like them? Michael never replied directly, because anything he said felt like a promise the sea might refuse to keep. On Tuesday morning, a woman they had come to know well, Mrs. Flaherty, who had once given Mary the rag doll for little Mary Jr., was found too weak to rise. Mary went to her immediately. The woman's face was pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes half open, as if she were watching something only she could see. I think I'm near the end of it, she whispered. Mary took her hand. You'll be all right, she said automatically, but neither of them believed it. The woman gave a faint smile. I've seen enough of this sea, she said softly. If there's a shore beyond it, I hope it's kinder than this one. Mary didn't respond. There was nothing to add. By midweek, fear had spread more quickly than disease. The memory of the sinking ship they had witnessed in week 7 now haunted every conversation. Children asked about it in whispers. Adults avoided the subject altogether. But silence didn't erase it. If anything, it made it worse. Brandon could still see it when he closed his eyes, the broken ship listing helplessly, the tiny figures on deck, the final disappearance beneath the waves. Now every cough sounded like an echo of that moment, every fever like a warning, every silence like an ending. One evening, Sean finally broke. He woke crying, convinced the ship was sinking. Mary held him tightly, trying to calm him. It's just the waves, she whispered. But what if it's like the other one, he sobbed. What if we don't see it coming? Michael knelt beside him. We will see it, he said gently. But even as he said it, he realized he was lying. Ships didn't always warn you before they failed, and the ocean didn't announce its intentions. The surgeon called Michael aside on Thursday. The conversation was brief. There are more cases developing, he said. Michael understood what he meant. How many? The surgeon hesitated. Too many. Michael looked back towards the hatch leading below. I thought we were past the worst of it. The surgeon shook his head. At sea there is no past the worst, only the next wave of it. He paused. Keep your family together, that's the only advice I can give you now. By Friday, several passengers were too ill to climb onto the deck at all. Sailors moved carefully throughout the hold, stepping over bodies that were not yet dead, but no longer fully present. A priest moved among them as well, offering prayers where they were welcomed and silence where they were not. Even the ship itself seemed different, slower, heavier, as though it too was carrying too many invisible burdens. That night, Michael stood on deck long after the others had gone below. The wind was cold, the sky clouded. He thought of Ireland not as it had been, but as it was becoming in memory, distant, softened, almost unreal. He thought of the children he had lost, of the people who had disappeared one by one into sickness, of the ship they had watched sink, of the Atlantic that had taken without hesitation and without pause. Behind him, a cough rose from the deck below, then another, then several, a chorus of fragility. Mary joined him quietly. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally she said, "Do you think anyone survives this?" Michael looked out at the dark water. "I don't know." She nodded as though that answer had been expected. "I used to think America was the hardest part," she said. Michael gave a faint, tired exhale. "It isn't America we're fighting." Mary glanced towards the hatch. "No," she said softly, "it's the ship." As the 9th week ended, fear had settled into every corner of the vessel. Not the sharp fear of storms, nor the immediate fear of death, but something slower, deeper. A belief spreading quietly among many passengers that the voyage itself had become larger than their ability to survive it. Still the ship moved forward. Sails caught the wind, timbers held for now, and somewhere beyond the grey horizon, unseen and unreachable, America remained. Whether it would be reached by those aboard this vessel, no one could say. But for the first time since leaving Ireland, hope was no longer something they carried forward. It was something they were trying not to lose entirely. Week 10. By the 10th week, the ship had begun to feel less like a vessel and more like a drifting memory. The Atlantic had long since erased any sense of direction or certainty, and days blended into one another in a dull rhythm of creaking timber, coughing below deck, and a constant, unchanging push westward. For those still strong enough to stand, the world had shrunk to 3 things: the sea, the sky, and survival. Below deck, sickness still lingered, but something had changed. Exhaustion replaced panic. Fear had dulled into quiet endurance. People no longer reacted to every cough or fever with alarm. Instead, they watched in silence, as though waiting for the sea itself to decide who would remain and who would not. The O'Sullivan family had survived where others had not, but survival no longer felt like victory. It felt like waiting. Mary moved through each day with a stillness that frightened Michael more than her grief. She spoke rarely. When she did, it was in short sentences, as if words cost more strength than she could afford. Brandon and Sean had grown thinner, but steadier. Children in their own way adapted faster than adults. They learned the new rules of the ship: where to walk, where not to look, when to speak, and when silence was safer. But even they no longer asked about America. Not anymore. On Tuesday, a small group of passengers was carried up to the deck for air. Some had not been outside in days, others in weeks. The sight of the opening sky had become almost unfamiliar. One man had to be helped to his feet simply to look at the horizon. Another wept without explanation, as though the act of seeing the world above deck had reminded him of something he had forgotten how to feel. Michael helped Mary to sit near the rail. She closed her eyes against the wind. "I used to think it would feel different when we were close," she whispered. "Closer to what?" Michael asked. "America," she said. Neither of them spoke after that, because neither of them knew what close meant anymore. By midweek, however, something began to change. At first, it was nothing more than a rumour passed between sailors, a shift in colour of the water, a faint change in the wind. Birds seen where none had been seen for weeks. Small signs, easy to dismiss unless they weren't. It was late Friday morning when the lookout shouted from the mast, "Land!" For a moment no one reacted. The word had been spoken so often in hope and disappointment that it had lost meaning. Then it came again, "Land off the starboard bow!" This time everything changed. Passengers who were able surged towards the deck. Those too weak were helped, carried, or even dragged into the light. Mary was among them, supported on one side by Michael and on the other by Brandon. Sean ran ahead, climbing the steps 2 at a time, and when they reached the deck, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then they saw it. A thin, distant line upon the horizon, faint, almost indistinguishable from cloud, but real, undeniably real. Land. For several seconds there was silence, not disbelief, not hesitation, just the overwhelming shock of something long imagined finally becoming visible. Then the sound broke across the ship, crying, laughter, prayer. Shouts that did not form complete sentences. Men who had not spoken in days collapsed to their knees. Some kissed the wooden planks of the deck. Others simply stared, afraid that looking away might cause the land to vanish. Sean grabbed Michael's arms. "It's real," he said, almost accusingly, as if needing confirmation from someone older, someone who could not be wrong. Michael nodded slowly. "It's real." Brandon stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Mary covered her mouth with both hands. For the first time in weeks, her face changed. Not to joy exactly, but to something like possibility. The news spread below deck faster than any sickness ever had. Even those too weak to stand were told. Even those who could not reach the stairs were carried up just long enough to see. Hope, long suppressed by exhaustion and grief, surged through the ship like a tide in reverse. People began speaking again, not in whispers of survival, but in plans, work, food, homes, a future that suddenly felt less like a dream and more like something that might actually arrive. That evening the ship slowed slightly as the crew confirmed their position. The land was still distant, still faint, but it was there, real enough to anchor every prayer that had been spoken since leaving Ireland. On deck, passengers gathered as the sun began to set behind the shoreline. The sky burnt orange and gold, and the sea reflected it like fire on water. For a brief moment, the Atlantic no longer felt endless. It felt like something they were about to leave behind. Michael stood with his family near the rail. None of them spoke for a long time. Then Sean said quietly, "We made it." Mary did not answer immediately. She watched the distant land as though afraid it might still disappear. Finally she whispered, "Almost." But even that word carried something new, not certainty, not safety, but direction. As night fell, the ship continued towards the unseen coast. Lanterns were lit across the deck. Below, for the first time in weeks, the sound of coughing was joined by something else. Conversation, plans, and even laughter, fragile but real. Hope had returned, not fully, not for everyone, but enough to be felt. For the O'Sullivan family, the 10th week ended with something they'd not felt since leaving County Kerry: belief. Not in certainty, not in survival guaranteed, but in the possibility that the ocean would finally release them. And for the first time in a very long time, that possibility was almost enough.